see what the civil society has done. Then at the end, I would link it back to the need for good governance, you know, as it were, and probably we could be able to pick one or two lessons as I speak. The first government effort I want to talk about was in 2011, when we finally, the next slide, when we finally got what we call the Freedom of Information Act, you know, into a law. It used to be the FY bill. It's now an act of parliament. In 2011, after about, you know, 12 years of serious agitation from the civil society, you don't know the value of 12 years until you give birth to a child and you discover your child is 12. At 12, a child is already almost getting into the teenage age. So it took us 12 years, a 12 years journey that ended in 2011, when we finally got the Freedom of Information Act, you know, passed and signed into law. Now, as beautiful as this law, you know, happened to be, that enabled citizens to get information from government, you know, apart from issues of national security, because of the size of Nigeria in terms of the states in Nigeria, it became difficult for us, you know, to engage at the subnational level. So what it meant was that if I wrote a letter to a federal agency, for example, and I requested for information, how much are you spending on education in 2021? I could get responses, no matter how long it would take, you know. But if I wrote the same letter to a governor or a government in a state, we have 36 of them, by the way, I may not get any information. Now, so what happened was that we went to the court. Next slide. We had to go to the court, and the court affirmed that the Freedom of Information law, you know, applies to all the states in the country because it's a federal law. But you see, this was a problem when we got this judgment at the appeal court. The governor of Ondo State, the state where my parents actually come from, went to the Supreme Court. So in Nigeria, you start from the High Court, you go to the appeal court, then you go to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the federal court. And for some of us, the Freedom of Information law is actually a moral law, for the lack of a better word. How do I mean? If you promise to govern me or you promise to lead me, and we get into a social contract, I need to understand what you're doing with the funds you're managing on my behalf. So we say to people, there's nothing like government money. The money belongs to the citizens, it's kept in trust, you know, of the government. But some people in the government feel the money is theirs, so they want to always set those roadblocks, you know, to it. But good news is we're making so much progress. Since 2015, 2016, the case has been at the Supreme Court. We're waiting for the final judgment on that. That judgment, you know, will put a final nail to the coffin, you know, of government agencies, be it at the state or the federal level, refusing to share information. The second thing the government has been able to do is that we've been able to sign up to the OGP, the Open Government Partnership. Now, one of the few things the Open Government Partnership, you know, has been able to do for us as a country in Nigeria, I don't know the realities in other African countries, is that it has opened us up to more realities, right? People can now engage with government. When the FOI law was passed in 2011, there was no OGP. Nigeria had not signed up to the OGP. Yeah? And so, 4 years after, the government signs up to the OGP. Very beautiful landmark. I mean, we celebrated everywhere, you know, within the civil society space, because for us, we've actually been advocating for that. With the OGP came open contracting, open parliament, open treasury, and the government actually went ahead. The next slide. The government actually went ahead to set up. Can you guys hear me? Okay, great. I have to put this in. All right. Okay, great. The government actually went. Go to the next slide, please. I'll come back to this. Go to the next slide. I should go to the next slide. Okay, yeah. The government actually set up what is called the Nigerian open treasury, open portal, right? So for the first time in Nigeria, you could be able to go online and pick up what the government says they are doing, commitments of the government in terms of expenses, you know, in terms of contracting, in terms of openness generally, which was part of the benefit of the government signing up to the OGP. But I tell you what, since 2018, there has been no data set uploaded on this site, right? So you see that we take one step forward, we take few backward. But I mean, at least we have something. So the government has been able to do something. Before I move on, I just want to talk about some pillars. The pillars. Go back to the next slide. Okay, this is just loaded. All right, great. And I think this is important because this is going to set the tone for the next things I'm going to be saying. There are various pillars of the Open Government Partnership, and it's very important that we understand that in the perspective of the Nigerian state, as it were. Transparency and accountability. I happen to play in that space, and one of the realities I've seen is the fact that the government doesn't want to be transparent, neither does it want to be accountable. I mean, like I said, the government feels it's their money. They feel that they can do anything and get away with it, even if we're in a democracy that provides for the rights of citizens. So today in Nigeria, we have 20 million out-of-school children, right? I mean, how many African countries are actually up to 20 million? We have 20 million out-of-school children, which was, this data was released by UNESCO about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And it's a shame because that's the, biggest, black country, in the world with 20 million out-of-school children. We have an inflation that has just hit, over 20%. A few years ago, the inflation was probably, we're trying to battle with single digits, keeping it at a single digit, right? If you had 5,000 naira, or if you had $1,000 in your account, not just citizens, governments to be able to collaborate together. Because without the people, there cannot be a government. It's the people that give legitimacy to a government, then innovation and ambition. And these pillars are very important because I will try to explain how civil society organizations have been able to use, all of these openings the OGP has given to us, to drive, the level of success, we need. So push it forward to 2 slides, the next and the next. Right, the next one now. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, civil society's effort. Let's drill deeper into this. The first civil society organization I want to talk about is what we call Budget. The next slide. Yeah, Budget is an organization who decided to begin to make the budget understandable and more funkified. So what I mean is, the budget document is a very cumbersome document. I mean, sometimes you see it's in a whole lot of pages, and I think, most governments do that to discourage citizens from really, engaging with the budget. But Budget was able to, summarize, those very bulky documents, boring documents that just have numbers, into very beautiful infographics. And that has been able to ensure that more citizens understood, understands what is in the budget, number one, understands how the budget affects them, and they're able to understand, what is supposed to come to their community from the budget. Now, that only means that more citizens are empowered with information to be able to hold their governments to account. So Budget also created another tool, which is a civic tech tool, by the way, called Tracker, right? Tracker, on the other hand, is concentrating on the parliament and looking at constituency projects. In Nigeria, we have what is called constituency project. Now, so because the politicians want to always perpetuate themselves in government, they feel that until you do something significant in your community would not vote for you again, right? So even if it's not in their core responsibilities to execute projects, they found a way to slot in what is called constituency projects in the budget, right? So what happens is every senator, for example, gets 100 million naira, every year, to execute government projects in his community, right? Now, because of the gaps, where we realize that some of these guys just take that money and do not do anything, Budget introduced Tracker to be able to track those constituency projects, and how they are getting out. The next organization I want to look at is PPDC. So PPDC, we call them procurement monitors, because one of the liberties of the Open Government Partnership is open procurement, where the system is open, the procurement system is so open, that citizens can be able to follow up on the processes, from the call to the submission of bids, to the opening of the bids, to when the contractor gets the contract, to when the contractor goes to the field, right? And these guys have been able to do a whole lot of stuff in terms of making sure, that procurement documents are readily available for citizens to be able to run with. Because citizens cannot hold government to account on what they do not know about. So all of these organizations, one way or the other, have been able to use the instrumentality of the Freedom of Information Act, to get this information from government, though through very rigorous processes. I have an organization, there's an organization in Nigeria called SERA. Their professionals are taking the government to court. Because most of these other organizations do not do litigation, we have to now rely on SERA to go to court on our behalf when government doesn't give us information. Now what happens is it elongates the processes and systems. For example, if I have 1 week to work on a project and it takes almost 4 weeks for government to give me data, what is the need of open data in the first place, right? So, it shows how these organizations go through very rigorous processes, to ensure that we get, these data sets we need, to do good work. The next slide is PLSI. PLSI is actually Partnership Leadership Support Initiative. Now, what PLSI has decided to focus on in Nigeria as a civil society organization is to focus on the audits. Another gap we realized is the fact that when monies are spent, nobody is in charge of auditing. Nigeria has an auditor general, whose responsibilities are actually tied, to the parliament, which is not supposed to be so. Two offices that are very important in accountability and transparency: the office of the auditor general and the office of the accountant general. The accountant general keeps the books. The auditor general ensures that the books tally. Those of us who play in the civil society space, that one of the things your donors will always do is to come back, and audit your account. In fact, they want you to even audit your account first, before they come back to ensure that your books are tidy. Now, if small organizations can go through those rigorous processes, how be it, a government that is saddled with the responsibility to manage lives and property, that is saddled with the responsibility to manage the resources of the people. So PLSI, for example, is playing heavy in that field, ensuring that governments at all levels, submit their audited report. And it's very important. It's part of civil society's efforts. Because I met our friend from Accountability Lab yesterday, I'm not sure he's here, I decided to slot in Accountability Lab, into my presentation. Accountability Lab, though fairly new in Nigeria, has been able to do something very important and significant. They've been able to identify, accountability heroes across the country, across various sectors: the public sector, the police, the civil society sector, the private sector. And what Accountability Lab in Nigeria has been able to do is to push people who have been able to, through impeccable character, gotten a name for themselves and celebrate them on a very large stage. It's one thing for you to always call out crime. It's one thing for you to always call out government embezzlement. It's another thing for you to celebrate those people who have painstakingly taken, the path of being different. So whilst people do naming and shaming, Accountability Lab is actually praising those people who has been able to show, through consistency and good attitude, that they can be able to do well. Right? The next organization I'm going to talk about is the one I currently, work for. Right? Follow the Money. Right? I know we have Follow the Money in Zimbabwe. Follow the Money, for example, started in 2012. And we started by saving over 1,400 young children from dying of lead poison. But much more than that, we're able to track the funds, that caused the lead poison, and the funds, given for remediation by the United Nations and the Nigerian government. But after that experience, we discovered that because citizens, number one, do not know what funds, where the funds are coming from, what the funds are going to do, and who is responsible for the funds, it was easy for these government guys to steal this money. All right. So we started a consciousness through a network of marginalized citizens, to push for citizens to know more about the budget. Remember that I said budgets had simplified the budget for everyone. So we refer people to the right places that can get information. But much more than that, through community outreaches and town hall meetings where we bring civil society organizations, we bring citizens and the parliament, we've been able to drive and ensure that government projects are not abandoned, number one. Government projects, monies devoted to those projects are dutifully, implemented as we go. And we've been able to save the Nigerian government over, $100 million, from ensuring that when a contractor gets a project, he must be able to go to the field with the collaboration of the community and execute those projects, right? And it's very important. It's part of the efforts of the, civil society. The next organization I want to talk about is probably the oldest, when it comes to conversations around the OGP in Nigeria. And it's Transparency International. How many of us know Transparency International? Yeah, I think Transparency International is not really popular with the government of Nigeria because of the kind of statistics they give of Nigeria. But Transparency International has been able to do something unique for us. And that is the Corruption Perception Index. Now, what they've been able to do with that is to highlight, how countries are faring in terms of corruption perception. And so anytime you want to see the government go very crazy, just wait for Transparency International to release the Corruption Perception Index, right? In 2021, for example, Nigeria ranked 154, out of 180 countries, right? And we've not left that region of, either 150, 154, it feels like our destiny is tied to that number, but we're trying to change that. It's been a tough call. And so for us, Transparency International is doing something very remarkable, guys. They're trying to show to us that, hey, no matter what the government, says is doing, if the perception of corruption is not reducing, then the government is not doing enough. Then those of us in the space would have to double up on our efforts to ensure, that we're influencing the space, opening up the space, and ensuring that lives and properties are protected. Because if you want to look at the value chain of corruption, the value chain of corruption is such that if roads are not constructed but money is released, people are going to have accidents and die on the road. You know why they are going to die? Because the hospitals are not functional. The emergency services are not functional, right? And so when there's bad roads, there are no medical facilities, there are no emergency systems. What will happen is even people that were not supposed to die from such accidents would end up dying. And I'll tell you guys a very sad story. My colleague, one of my colleagues last year, he was one of the greatest guys you met in Nigeria. Very awesome, sweet-spirited guy. Goes out to play soccer, and he slumps on the field. And when he slumps, people rushed, took him to the first hospital. The doctor came down, tried to resuscitate him, said he still had pulse. The doctor went back upstairs and didn't come out for 10 minutes. Now, someone that had a heart failure definitely must have passed out. Finally, within that time frame. From the first hospital, we went to the second hospital, we went to the third hospital, and I lost my colleague. Very young guy, was about getting married. In fact, it was his fiance's birthday that day. And for the life of me, I saw the realities of the work that I do and other guys in the civil society space in Nigeria to ensure that the quality of life of an average Nigerian is held to high esteem in terms of public health. If that could happen to someone who, is literate, he's good, he lives a very comfortable life. How about those people living in remote areas, in remote communities? And that's why, for me, I've taken it upon myself to double down on this work and not just look at it from the prism of the work I do, but look at it from the extent of lives we're going to be able to save when we ensure that governments are really open, when we ensure that we can hold government to account, based on the principles of the OGP. The next slide, Nyasha, thank you. Now, this is very interesting for me, and it's called the Open Pali Nigeria, right? I think Nigeria is one of the youngest babies. I know there's a session where we're going to drill down on this, so I'll not stay too much on this. Youngest babies in the Open Parliament, Open Pali network, and because we've been in for just about a year. For the first time in my life, I saw people get interested in what is going on in subnational parliaments in Nigeria, just because of Open Pali. Just because of Open Pali. The network is heavy, the reach is very interesting. People are asking questions like they've never done before. I practically traveled to all the states where we have Open Pali in, and I was really impressed by the kind of consciousness, these ideas, drive, which falls under the pillar of innovation, under the OGP. Because Nigeria is signatory to the Open Government Partnership, we're now able to have these kind of innovations come into the country and to drill down on the work that we do. I said I was going to end this presentation on the platform. Next slide. I was going to end it on the platform of good governance. Now, the efforts of the government and the efforts of civil society organization fit into a narrative. That narrative is the narrative for good governance. And good governance claims to have some few pillars. And I'll just go through the pillars. Number one, the rule of law. Without the rule of law, there's no governance. There's no democracy. Right? Nigeria flagrantly abuses the rule of law. I mean, they treat the rule of law according to how they feel. And, with those kind of systems, it becomes extremely difficult for citizens and those of us in the civil society, to be able to hold the government in any high esteem. Right? Can it get better? Yes, it can get better, and it's actually getting better. But it just shows that, even though we've used open data to drive this consciousness, more work needs to be done. More work needs to be done. We still have transparency issues. I forgot to tell you guys this. The auditor, the Accountant General of Nigeria is currently facing a corruption charge of about just a few billions, he stole, in his office, abuse of office. One person steals billions of naira, because he has the access to do so, and nobody, can question him. It's quite unfortunate. Good governance also ensures for consensus and building. Citizens must participate in the process of government, and that's what we're saying. That's what we're saying with Open Party. That's what we're saying with Follow the Money. That's what Budget is saying. That's what PLSI is saying. Citizens must be brought to the table to have, conversations. The government, we don't practice absolute monarchy, where one person will just sit and say, this is what we're going to do, and everybody queues behind them. No, it's a democracy. It's supposed to be government for the people, by the people. Efficiency and effectiveness. The moment you do not see all of these traits in any system, wherever you find yourself, it's a red flag. It shows that, more work, needs to be done. Then responsiveness of the government back to citizens is a battle we're fighting, and I think we're winning, because the moment we started using Twitter, for example, as a tool to hold government to account, it opened up the space totally. I remember sometime, a government agency blocked us on Twitter. It was one of the most memorable days of my work life, and I saw citizens who probably would never get into a conversation around government, call the government out, call the government institution out, and they had to apologize publicly for doing that. So we have that robust engagement between government and citizens that is really interesting, because of the open government partnership. With these few points of mine, I hope I've been able to convince you and not to confuse you that in Nigeria, whilst we've done a whole lot of stuff, more needs to be done. The government has done its own part. More needs to be done on the part of government. More needs to be done on the part of, the civil society organizations who are like the catalyst before the citizens. And at the end, we'll have a more egalitarian system. So if you want to ask me, have we made progress from where we used to be? And need I also say that all of the organizations I sampled to you guys are less than 15 years old. If we've been able to achieve this in 15 years, I imagine what the next 15 years, would be like. We'll definitely have made more progress, than we've made, in the current 15 years. Thank you very much for listening, guys.
Another round of applause, a healthy round of applause for him. Thank you very much for that. As you were speaking, I had to keep looking at you and saying, are you not Zimbabwean? Because some of the problems you were highlighting there, we actually face here. So, the issue of open government is very important because that's how citizens know what actually is happening. Recently, the Parliament of Zimbabwe, actually awarded a tender to a company that was going to buy 170 laptops. And each laptop, we wouldn't have known this if one of the losing bidders did not expose this letter. So imagine if we had a transparent process in terms of procurement, we would have known this as citizens and we would have made noise already. But one of the disgruntled losers my apologies for a lack of a better word, then leaked the letter, and then there was outrage on social media, and everybody, was in the conversation. And fortunately for Open Pali Zimbabwe, we managed to live stream those conversations now when the members of parliament were now grilling the parliamentary directorate on why they had chosen that particular contractor exactly. So we were going to be spending over millions of dollars without us knowing. But this is important. I think this is why we're having these conversations, so that we as citizens also fight for open government. Nigeria is part of open government. We are not signed up yet, but it's our responsibility as journalists, as Zimbabweans, as citizens, to push for that, because the more we're transparent, the more money can be used effectively and efficiently. So thank you very much for that. Questions. Let's have a 5-minute questions, a round of questions for 5 minutes, and then we move on to the next program. Questions, comments. Nobody wants to learn from him. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that. I think you touched on it a little bit, but could you dive a little bit deeper into how you've seen government respond when these things are out? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, should I take this?
Yes, go ahead.
Right. So, I try to say 15 years before now, citizens didn't even know what was in the budget. Right? We just hear that the government has signed the budget. We didn't know how much. Okay, they'll give you that broad sum, but it was never broken down into ministries, departments, and agencies, right? Now, there was no one practically. I mean, from 1999, for example, the presidents were cruising. Parliament was cruising. The parliament and the executive were like buddies. The only time we hear what's happening is when they have a fight, But now, the moment the budget is going to parliament from the executive, we already have the information. Budget is already working on the summary of that, right? So more citizens begin to call out. There's what is called the frivolous items in the budget, where the government decides to buy computers every year. The president feels his Mercedes-Benz, is old, but it's just 1 year, right? Now, the president and the vice president would be spending billions to feed in a year. Citizens never understood these things before. But the moment these data sets, through the instrumentality of the open data, I believe they are regretting why they signed, the OGP. Citizens have more access to this information, and we're able to grow that consciousness, not just on social media, but offline also, and people are having conversations. Now, this is what the government does. The government pushes back, immediately. The government hires more media aides than they hire technocrats who can think. So those hirelings go on social media and begin to tweet in support of the government. But facts don't lie, right? The moment, you have verifiable facts, which is data, you can be able to hold anybody to account. So the only way they can deny it is when we mount so much pressure on the parliament, because the parliament, citizens now have access to watch, budgetary reviews by each committees in the parliament. So it's now open when they are going through those line items, and you see that, the government, but you see, unfortunately, we've not been able to have the kind of vibrant parliament we're looking for in Nigeria that can be able to be the real check to the excesses of the executive. So when the parliamentarians want to hoodwink, the executive arm of government, they'll tell them, okay, what is in for me? When the executive arm settles them, everybody goes, and the citizen still loses in the long run, right? So, but it's getting better in the sense that people no longer give up. When people run with those kind of information, it probably tells on the next election. So more people are careful, when they are getting. So that increased consciousness is helping us build the ecosystem where it's no longer business as usual. It's no longer business as usual. We've had the government arrest people, right? In my adulthood as a Nigerian, in the last 7.5 years, we've had the civic space shrink like never before. right? It's like we're going back to the military, maybe because the president used to be a former military man, you know. We're going back to those times where they blackmail you with the talker of fake news as made popular by Donald Trump, you know. So everything now is fake news. But because of open data, we have evidence. So it's difficult for them to arrest some of us, right? But I tell you what, freelance journalists, they are going through a whole lot in Nigeria. Because the moment you probably do not have that institutional backing, you know, you may be thrown into jail. I mean, a guy just got released yesterday. He's been there for over 210 days, you know, because he published what was in was you could even Google and I mean, his governor, you know, he used to be a fraudster in the U.S. and he published it and he got jailed, you know, even without trial. You know, the case wouldn't fly in court, so they released him after 210 days. You know, so sometimes it could be, we don't have the kind of experience, you know, you were sharing about in Uganda. We don't have those kind of experiences yet. You know, but I tell you, even before, you know, the civil rule, I mean, we've had government send letter bombs to people, you know, who stand against them. I mean, there's still a case that is still unsolved. The Delegiwa assassination. He's a journalist, got a letter, boom, opens it and it goes up in flames, right? So it used to be tough. We've moved, but we're not there yet.
Thank you very much for that. We're glad that it's moving. I have 3 questions, but we need to move on to the next section. Okay, let me just get one more question.
All right.
I just wanted to address a difference between facts and data.
Okay.
Data in the sense that what is presented to us, but may not actually be factual. So when a government is now subject to freedom of information, in your experience, do you see a phenomenon where maybe they start to hire people to present data that suits their particular agenda? In other words, it's data, but it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, you're very correct. You're very spot on. So with some laws that have been strengthened here and there, for example, the procurement law, and let me tell you one of the things that happened during COVID. There was a lockdown, and you know, it was 2020. The government decides to begin to give people handouts, the poorest of the poor people. But instead of sending it to bank accounts, they started giving them cash. That is one of the funds you can never track. You can't. There's no money trail, you know, for that, right? And so we went to the market and we said, hey, you can't be doing this. This is 2021. But the government and the hirelings I spoke about showed us pictures of government officials actually distributing the money. But we knew that 20K was given, 20,000 naira was given, but 18,000 was returned back to government and the people went back with 2K. We knew, right? But because we couldn't get more evidences to show that this was the reality across board, you know, it was difficult for us to actually run with those kind of stories, right? So sometimes fact in itself may not be as sacred as we think, in the sense that, you know, corrupt people are also innovative. They know how to try to wiggle their way out of the situation. But the truth of the matter is, if you ask every Nigerian, you definitely know that the humanitarian ministry, you know, was part of a very big fraud during COVID-19. You guys can even Google it. Warehouses were destroyed because people were hungry, and you know, stockpile of foods were kept in warehouses. And you know, I saw Nigerians for the first time, you know, pulling down warehouses to go get food. Now we could prove that, but we couldn't prove the fact that 20K was given, 18K was collected back, even if it happened. And so you're spot on. It could go that way. You know, but for some of us, we really do not want to win all, because we can't win all. We just take the ones that are significant, drive citizens' engagement and citizens' knowledge, for them to begin to hold their own governments to account. Because, I mean, and maybe lastly, those of us in the civil society space, we're not heroes. And I think sometimes we try to overrate ourselves with the fact that we do very good work, you know, across communities, and we begin to feel so important. No, we're not. We're just ordinary citizens with more information. And if we want to survive, if we want to ensure that the system works, the knowledge and information we have must be passed down to at least the least intelligent of people in communities, least educated people, for them to begin to do the work that we do. Imagine we have about 10 people per local government, 774 local governments in Nigeria, doing the work that Follow the Money is doing, for example. Would liberate the entire system. You understand? So maybe our conversation could drive more towards, citizens' participation, owning, their own lives in their own hands. Because for some of us, we may never experience what those people experience. I was saying to someone, even if fuel becomes 1,000 naira, that's about over $1 now, because our currency is, has a shaky head, shaking like some people's presidents. So shaky, I can afford that because I earn. But there are people living in rural communities, who cannot afford that. So citizens must be able to wake up, to hold their governments to account.
Thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, I can't take any more questions.